Moving back to our paper speakers and to our second speaker in proposition of the motion, I'd like to welcome Vaishnav Rajkumar. Vaishnav is an MPhil student reading Politics and International Studies at Pembroke. He'll be pursuing a Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School after graduation. He won the right to speak through open audition. Vaishnav, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you, Madam President. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the House. Tuvalu is an independent island nation in the South Pacific, comprised of 9 islands. For close to 2 decades, the sea level around the islands of Tuvalu has been rising, giving the apparent effect that the islands themselves are sinking. Today, 2 of those 2 islands are almost completely submerged, but with scientists predicting that all 9 islands will be completely underwater by the end of the century. A terrible situation, a horrifying and startling situation, and yet why is it that I can guarantee that most of you seated in this House tonight haven't even heard of Tuvalu? It's a simple answer, and it is one that will tie this admittedly long-winded introduction back to the motion. Put simply, it is the impact of an unbalanced global power structure. And if we dig deeper into the reason behind this imbalance, I'm sure you won't be surprised that we arrive at the everlasting impacts of colonialism. And as a second speaker for the government, I thought I would take it upon myself to try and extend upon our case by framing this debate as effectively as possible. And I thought I'd start by pointing out that if we're talking about reparations, while the most obvious ramifications of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade are no doubt of the highest priority, it is the highest priority on a list that unfortunately spans across a number of heinous manifestations of imbalanced power structures that exist in society even today, including climate change. And so when we talk of reparations today, don't allow your minds to be clouded by the assumption that the reparations are only for the dastardly acts of a bygone colonial era. Allow me to show you why reparations are important, not just as a means of atoning for your past sins, but of recognizing and changing this House's trajectory from one that seems destined to be committing even more in this new neo-colonial era. That said, I would like to once again recognize that the crux of this debate is the colonialism of old that underpins this motion. As far as reparations are concerned, it is very much the original sin, and I'll be using this as my primary case study to prove my 3 main arguments. I have 1 moral and 2 practical standpoints. First, I'll tell you about the moral obligation of those who are unfairly advantaged to recognize and take responsibility for their actions. And yes, there still does exist this moral responsibility. Second, I'll give you some statistics on the exploitation and concerted economic and political ruin of the colonies in the last couple of centuries. I'll make the monetary argument for reparations. And finally, I'll leave you with some practical considerations on the future externalities of reparations as deterrence for policy inequalities in fields such as climate change. But before I move on to my actual arguments, I do have some points of rebuttal to the previous speaker, and I believe this is where my problem lies in this debate, because I'm just not sure where to start as far as rebuttal is concerned. The previous speaker, I think the main issue comes up at the point where he comes up and says that we're only dealing with the transatlantic slave trade today because it is a fashionable choice, and that is the only reason why we're having this motion. We're not just dealing with that, we're also dealing with colonization, we're also dealing with the impacts on India and Pakistan, and plenty of other colonies of the British Empire.
Bangladesh too.
Yes, plenty of other colonies, Bangladesh included, thank you. And I think if we weren't, then I have 10 minutes worth of useless words to waste the House's time at this point. But I think it's important to also recognize on the idea that no one apparently alive today was directly involved in the colonization, and therefore they shouldn't be held accountable. Well, what if I said that there are those alive today who are and continue to be directly impacted by the impacts of that colonization? There's a POI by the gentleman who perfectly encapsulated this. And in this way, I'll continue in my speech to show you why reparations continue to be important. There's the idea that the acts of colonization are not entirely bad. There's the idea that we need more data to prove on our side of the house why exactly reparations are required. There's the idea that apparently we don't have a say in the amount that goes into reparation. But I tell you that we are a democratic nation. The very fact that we are debating this motion in the House tonight is a key signifier to show you that you do have a say and that you should vote for proposition. All the rest of my rebuttal I'll integrate in my arguments. My first argument draws on the ideas of the principles of reparations, and it's something that I'm drawing from a speech that I first heard 7 years ago from Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who was a former diplomat and currently an MP in India. The speech was by all means a tremendous success, if you forgive the fact that it was given at the Oxford Union. This speech was so successful that it has its own Wikipedia page today. And I was adamant when I won the right to speak that I would try my best to avoid ending up parroting these arguments. And in true British parliamentary fashion, I found a loophole. I will instead extend upon his comments for this, the remainder of my first argument. Dr. Tharoor suggests that reparations are, above all, a symbolic requirement. Now, what does this mean? This can be attributed to the moral obligation of colonial powers to recognize and exceed their guilt in the atrocities of the 19th and 20th centuries. My previous speaker would have you believe this has already been done, but I tell you this isn't enough. Equally importantly, this can also result in a much-needed changing of the narrative. For far too long, for instance, popular discourse on the colonization of India has been treated to a response along the lines of the following. But we gave you railways. And I'm very happy my previous speaker actually said this because it's something I had written down, and it's a perfect encapsulation of precisely why discourse needs to change. What I mean by this is that there is a tendency to try and make the colonial era out to be something that may have been damaging, but had its fair share of advantages for the colonies themselves. The most prominent examples are the building of railways and the establishment of telephone poles and all of that by the British in India. To this day, it's something that's talked about as a positive. But even more alarming is the realization that this popular discourse is the result of a failing education system when it comes to the horrors of colonialism. Currently, it is not compulsory for primary and secondary school students in the UK to learn about Britain's history in colonialism. What reigns instead are the misguided understandings of colonialism as not being all bad. A rose-tinted notion that often glosses over the sheer violence and brutality that characterized the British Empire, and attempt to justify the transgressions of the past as not being so bad, or that there were bad conditions that we heroically helped change. And this very much hits at the center of the "we gave you railways" excuse. Ladies and gentlemen, it is high time that we start dismantling this harmful, muddled narrative, and we recognize the colonial era for the inexcusable horror show that it was. And so when we speak of reparations, my first argument on principle is that we do not need on-site proposition to necessarily defend the notion of an exceptionally large, complexly calculated monetary sum. What we need above all else is symbolic reparation. A payment of £1 so nominal it could be as much as a single penny, but it carries with it the value of an admission of guilt and an apology for the ages. A payment that will bring the era of colonialism back to the forefront of your history classes, but in a hopefully much more accurate representation. You will no doubt have noticed that this symbolic payment, of course, has the added benefit of quelling any opposition from my respected peers on the opposite bench that reparations may be an unfair burden on the people of Britain. But in the spirit of this debate, I will take the argument in their best, and I will explain to you why even a full, properly calculated monetary compensation by way of reparation is very much warranted, which I'll get to in my next 2 points of this POI.
I think you might preempt it.
Okay, excellent. This is my second argument for the evening, and I guess one that will perhaps cause the most distress in this House tonight, not because it is particularly controversial, but because of the sheer number of lost lives and the brutal ramifications of colonialism that is my great displeasure to detail for you tonight. During the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 in India, which resulted in the death of close to 3 million people, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused to provide aid, instead suggesting the fault was that of the Indians for breeding like rabbits. But then consider this. How, in a country like India with an admittedly high birth rate, was there no increase in population for a 74-year period between 1860 and 1934? A question easily answered by looking at the number of Indian lives that were lost during the British Raj in India. A number so high, it is not calculable precisely today, with conservative estimates placing it anywhere between 40 and 60 million. That's 60 million people who were forced to fight wars for the British, who were starved to death, or tortured to death, or maimed or whipped, or any number of cruel displays of a hunger for power and a great greed for an ever-expanding empire. Now, I'll certainly be there to admit that you cannot place a monetary value on the loss of life, something that Bell so eloquently put to you earlier. But you can certainly try, and anything to the contrary is nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse. And next, I invite you to look at the extent of direct British involvement in these deaths, because it's way too easy to chalk up these deaths by famine to something like natural disasters. But extensive studies show you that the effects of the famines, and yes, that's plural, famines, were directly exacerbated and sometimes even caused by the land grabs and resource exploitation of the British. Now, a previous speaker was very fond of data and facts, so I'll give you some facts. India is a country that entered the 18th century as a major economic player, comprising 27% of the world's GDP. When it gained its independence in 1947, it contributed 3% of the world's GDP. Pre-colonial India had one of the first established forms of public schools called Gurukulas, with education considered universal for every citizen. The British left India with a literacy rate of 16%. But India is always the first example when we deal with British colonization. Let's look elsewhere. During the Second Boer War, the British ran concentration camps that resulted in the deaths of close to 30,000 Boers. Some historians believe that up to 100,000 people may have died in the Mau Mau uprisings in Kenya in the 1950s. This last case is particularly important since a number of the Kenyan veterans who fought in this war successfully sued the British government, who paid a sum of £19.9 million to the claimants. There's an example of people who didn't like the British colonizing them. So it's not like this house doesn't have a history of paying reparations. We just need a reminder of our conscience, and that is what the proposition bench is going to provide to you today. My final argument is brief and will look to the future. Why is it that paying reparations is a good move for the world in general? It recognizes that actions have consequences. More importantly, it signals that the abuse of systemic imbalances of power can no longer go unpunished. If you've been following the news, or indeed if you've just paid attention to Bell's speech, you'll know the importance of COP27. You'll know that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak recently opened the doors to potential discussions for climate change reparations. Countries like Tuvalu have been struggling for decades to make their voices heard in these sessions. Cliched as it may sound, it is the countries that contribute the least to climate change that are hit the hardest. And of course, the ones that contribute the most just happen to be among the richest and most developed nations in the world. This disproportionate impact lays the ground for something that is referred to as right-based climate change litigation, whereby the countries worst affected, yet largely ignored in the struggle against climate change, will be able to get the compensation that they deserve. In the capitalist world order we live in, it is a sad fact of the matter that it often takes a monetary loss for many of our governments to sit up and take notice of the problem. This is the final and arguably most important impact of my case tonight. And take this with you if you take anything away from my speech. That the idea of reparations will act as an important precedent, above all else, to guarantee and deter a further abuse of power imbalances on the global stage. And so as you walk out of those doors tonight, all I can ask is that you vote your conscience. And of course, that you walk through the door on the right. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening.